Hi, I'm Luke Fasanello,
I'm Andrew Cantiliano.
and this is our project video for CompSci 431. So I'm going to take you guys through our crow's foot diagram. Our project is for a database for like a library or a bookstore where you can buy or rent books. So this is our crow's foot diagram. I'll start with the employee table. So it has an employee ID, first name, last name, and a start date. Next, we have the manager table, which has a manager ID and an employee ID. Next, we have the rented table, which has a rental ID, book ID, customer ID, employee ID, a from date, which is when the book was rented, and a return date, which is when the book should be returned, and a return field, which basically just holds yes or no, which signifies whether or not the book has been returned yet. Next, we have the book table, which has a book ID, an author ID, a publisher ID, a year, language, pages, title, quantity, price of the book, and country. Next, we have the purchase table, which contains a purchased ID, book ID, customer ID, bought date, quantity purchased, employee ID, and a coupon ID. Next, we'll go to the authors table, which has an author ID, first name, and last name. The publishers table, which has a publisher ID and a name of the publisher. And then we have the coupons table, which has a coupon ID, a percentage, which is like the percentage that you get off on the purchase of a book by using the coupon, and an expiration date. And finally, we have the customer table, which contains a customer ID, a first name, and a last name. So now I'll go through the relations. So here, employee and manager are related through the employee ID, and it's a one-to-one relationship. Employee and rented are related through the employee ID as well, and it's a one-to-many relationship. And employee and purchased are related through the employee ID, and it's also a one-to-many relationship. Next, we have rented and book, which are related through a one-to-many relationship on the book ID. Book and purchased are related through a one-to-many relationship on the book ID as well. Book and author are related in a one-to-many relationship on the author ID. Book and publisher are related in a one-to-many relationship on the publisher ID. Next, we'll go to purchased and coupon, which are related in a one-to-many relationship on the coupon ID. And now we'll go to rented and customer, which are related in a one-to-many relationship as well on the customer ID. And finally, purchased and customer, which are related in a one-to-many relationship on the customer ID. So now I'll hand it over to Drew.
Yeah, and I'm going to take you guys through pretty much every aspect of the project from the user's point of view. So if I was the user, if I was an employee at the bookstore, I would start by logging in with my employee ID, with my first name, and then with my last name. And once I log in, it'll redirect me to the home page. And from the home page, I can choose between any number of tabs listed here above. And I'm going to start here with the reports. These are our two reports that we did. Report one, it's pretty simple. It's to get the title, year created, a number of pages of all books with more than a specific number of pages. So if a customer comes up to me and wants to know what books do you have that have more than 200 pages, I would just enter 200 here. And the report would return all the list of books with more than 200 pages ordered by the number of pages. So a less number of pages is up front, and then scrolling all the way down, we have larger number of pages here. So that's report one. Report two is a little more complicated. It's our 5-table join, which I'll touch on later in the presentation. This report allows us to get the ID, first name and last name of the manager who sold a book with the author having a specific last name. So if I wanted to know which managers sold a book whose author had the last name, of Achebe, it would return this list of managers, and this is ordered by the manager ID. So moving on from reports, we have the books table, and the books page is really the most important page of our website. And it probably has the most capabilities as well, which pretty much starts with the ability to insert a new book. So as you can see, we have a collection of books here. We have the ability to edit a book and delete a book from the collection, which I'll demonstrate later. But for now, I'm going to start with inserting a new book. So just as an example, we'll give it a book title, country, a quantity. We'll say the price is $10 in the year 2020. Language can be English. Number of pages, we'll say 150. And for our author name, let's go with a new author. And so when I enter an author name here, and if I enter a new author, it will create an entry in the publisher or in the authors table. And if I create a new publisher, it will enter a new entry into the publishers table. If I enter an author or a publisher that already exists, it'll reference those IDs below. So let's start with doing a new author. We'll say that this is our new author and this is our new publisher. So inserting this into the database, we have a new record. And if we scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll see that our book shows up with all the data that we entered with a new author ID and a new publisher ID. And we can even go and check that our new author was created with a unique ID, as well as a new publisher being created. Now, like I mentioned, we can also edit and delete entries. So say that we wanted to edit, say we wanted to change the country to Nigeria, and we wanted to increase the quantity because we got a new shipment of books and we wanted to change the price, for example. We can update this record and you'll see that all the changes are properly reflected with the new quantity, the new price, and the new country. Notice that when we try to change the book ID, nothing happens because the book ID is the primary key. It's auto incremented. So the book ID did not change to 95. It stayed what it was. And we can also delete a book by simply pressing the delete button. And this will completely delete the record from the collection of books. So that's how we create a new author and a new publisher and a new book. We can also insert a book that has a current author and a current publisher, and it'll reference those IDs in the books table. So for example, let's use Jane Austen, and for our publisher, we'll copy one of these. So as another example, we can do 50 English, 100 pages. So we said Jane Austen and publisher name. If we insert this book, as you will see in the collection, it references the author ID as 9 and the publisher ID as 10. Let's just make sure it worked. Author ID is 9, Jane Austen, and publisher ID is 10, Aubrey Luna. So that is how we insert books, insert authors, and also insert publishers. And it also references those IDs as well. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our ability to select a book from the list. We can select books basing it off any of these attributes. So say I wanted to search for any book in the year 1958 with a quantity of 2. So these are all, it returned all the books that were either in the year 1958 or had a quantity of 2. We can do any number of selects we want. So for example, say we wanted to find a book with the title of example and the quantity of 100. It will only return the example because there are no other quantities of 100. So this is an OR select. It takes each attribute and filters the list based off what the user inputs. Moving on to purchase books. This is where we have the transactions. So if we want to say a customer comes up and they want to purchase a book, this is where we would enter the transaction to do that. So for example, let's say the user wants to buy this book with this ID. Notice that there's only a quantity of 1. So we'll give them a sample customer ID, say 30, sample ID, we'll say 35. Coupon, say they have coupon number 19. They're purchasing it today. And there was only 1 book remaining, 1 quantity, and say that they wanted to purchase 2 of these. The record was unsuccessful because there was not the correct quantity. However, if they were to just purchase 1 book, say with the sample data points, the record would be successful because there was 1 book remaining. When you try to purchase 2 books and there's only 1 book, it doesn't work. But when you purchase the number of books that are less than or equal to the number of books available, the record will be successful. And notice that this new transaction showed up with the book that was purchased. And also, if we go back to the books table, we can see that the quantity decreased from 1 to 0 because a book was purchased and now that book is no longer available for other people to purchase. So that in a nutshell is purchase books. You can edit any number of these fields except for the transaction ID. So for example, say we made a mistake, we entered the wrong customer ID, we can easily change it from 30 to 39. And that change will be reflected here. So that is purchase books. Moving on to rented books. The way we designed our data model, we could only rent 1 book at a time. So for example, let's go back to the books table. We can see that this book has a quantity of 0, so it should not be able to be rented. But if a customer tries to rent it, it won't work because it's not available. If we try, say, this book here has a quantity of 2, so it should be able to be rented. Let's try. And it worked because the quantity is available. And the new entry shows up here. Notice if we go back to the books table, the quantity decreased from 2 to 1, which is correct. And now we can also edit these fields. Say that the customer came back and they returned their book, so we can mark it as returned. If we mark it as returned, the change is reflected in the data table. And also, the book quantity is back up to 2 because it is now available for other customers to use. So that's how rented books work. Again, you can edit any number of these fields except for rental ID. That's the primary key, that's auto increment. So yeah, that's rented books. Moving on to the authors table. This is a collection of all the authors. Like I showed earlier, the new author was created. You can edit any of these fields except for author ID, which is the primary key. So if I change the last name here, the change would be reflected. And you can't insert authors on this page. You can only insert authors when you're entering a new book. That was one of the key pieces that we had in our data model. And this is just another way of deleting information. We have 5 or more ways of inserting data, of modifying data, of deleting data through each of these 9 tables. And so publishers is very, very similar, pretty much the same fields as authors. So like I mentioned, if we created a new publisher when making a new book and when inserting a new book, the change would be reflected in the publishers table. You can't insert on the publishers page. You can only view, edit, and delete different data entries. So moving on to employees. Like Luke mentioned in the data model, there's an employee ID, first name, last name, and start date. We can insert a new employee if we properly enter the inputs, the user inputs. And we can edit as well, except for if the employee ID, if we try to change the employee ID, it won't work. It'll stay at 70. It won't go to 100, and we can delete entries as well. So moving on to managers. So all managers are employees. So the only thing that's necessary when creating a new manager or inserting a new manager is the employee ID. So if we wanted to promote Nancy Hill to manager, all we would have to do would be to enter her employee ID. And then she would have manager privileges. And once again, we can edit the employee ID, but we cannot touch manager ID because it's the primary key. And we can also delete as well. Moving on from managers, we have customers. Again, very, very similar to authors and publishers. There's an ID, a first name, a last name. We can insert and there will be an auto increment for their ID. So for example, if you wanted to change the first name here, the record will update and the change is reflected. Moving on from customers to coupons. This one, you can enter a % off an expiration date and it'll add a new coupon. And all of our coupons have percentages within 0 and 1. So for example, if I try to enter a percentage of 1, it'll complain. It'll say that it must be less than or equal to 0.99, and say I enter something that would never work. It must be greater than or equal to 0.01. So we have these constraints built into the front end, as well as the at the DBMS level too. And say I didn't enter in the proper date format. So I say this is a 50% off coupon, but I forgot to enter an expiration date. The website will complain. It'll say you have to enter the date in the proper format. So I'll go back and I'll choose an expiration date and a new record will be created. So that covers pretty much all of our functionality from the website. Like I demonstrated, we have a way of inserting data, a way of deleting data, a way of updating data. I demonstrated both of the reports. We have 5 or more ways of inserting, updating, and deleting between all these different tables with the edit and delete buttons. And we can also perform selections on lists based off of this functionality as well. So that's that's all of our aspects of the project. And now Luke will talk about transactions and rollbacks.
Okay. So, all right. So now I'll show you guys a transaction that commits and another one that rolls back. So as Drew was showing you guys before, you can't enter a purchased book without entering a quantity for that book that is less than or equal to the quantity available. So let's look at book 123607, Fairy Tales. Actually, let's do 123609, Pride and Prejudice, because it has a few more books. So that quantity is for, we'll go back to purchased books. This is 123609, right? Yeah. 123609, customer ID 50, employee ID 50, coupon ID 30, date purchased. Let's go today. And let's do quantity 5, which is greater than the quantity that's actually available. So let's do an insert and see, we get an error, checkbook quantity error. And that was a rollback. We can see that Pride and Prejudice quantity is still 4. Go back to purchase books, nothing new was entered. That's quantity 2. So let's go and do a new one where it actually works. We'll do 123609, quantity of 3. So a new record was created. We can see that down here, entry 64, 50, 50, 30, quantity 3. And we have 123609. And if we go back to books, we can see Pride and Prejudice quantity is now 1. So we do that in the insert transaction.php file. Here we have a try catch block. And in it, we have a begin transaction. Then we execute 2 SQL statements. One is an insert into the purchase table, and another is an update into the books table. And we have a trigger at the DBMS level that runs, I think, after an update on a book. And it just makes sure that the new quantity for the book is not less than 0. So if it is, we get an error and we roll back. And that's what you saw earlier when the book quantity wasn't updated. And then if it does run correctly, both of these statements are executed and we commit. So now I'll hand it over to Drew, who's gonna describe the select statement with 5 joins.
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, our report number 2, that satisfies the requirement for a 5-table join. And that 5-table join happens in this file here. So if I were to demonstrate one more time, going to reports, get the ID, first name and last name of the manager who sold a book with the author having a specific last name. For example, I enter this, I get all the managers ordered by manager name. And so that happens by joining the managers table, the employees table, the purchase books table, and the books table. So as you can see, in the code here, if I pull it up, wrong code. This one here. Oh, yep, select report. So our SQL select statement is right here. As you can see, we get the manager ID from the managers table, the employee first name, employee last name from the employees table. And those 2 tables are joined through the employee ID. Next, we have a join between the employee table and the purchase table. That's also joined by employee ID because an employee has to enter their ID in order to insert a transaction. Next, the purchase table and the books table are linked through a book ID, and the books table and the authors table are linked through an author ID. So those are our 5 tables that are joined. And like you saw in my demonstration, a user can insert any author last name, and it'll pull up all of this data based on the user input. So for example, if the user were to input the last name of an author that doesn't exist, it makes sense that the report would return no data. So that is our 5-table join as demonstrated in report 2. And yeah, that concludes our presentation, our final project video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and signing off.